Apache woman was dragged to his ranch, but the rancher wasn't a bad guy she thought he was. She stood near the edge of her camp, holding a woven basket, her dark hair tied back neatly. She was young, but her eyes carried the awareness of someone who had grown up during uncertain times. Nijoni had been raised among her people in the wide desert lands. She knew the language of the wind, the meaning of animal tracks, and the way the sky changed before a storm. Her grandmother often told her that the desert spoke to those who listened carefully. That evening, the desert was warning them. In recent months, tension between Apache bands and nearby settlers had grown. Livestock had gone missing. Supplies had been stolen. Each side blamed the other. Rumors traveled faster than horses, and fear followed closely behind. Nijoni had heard stories of ranchers who believed every Apache was an enemy. She had also heard stories of her own warriors who believed no settler could be trusted. But Nijoni herself had never spoken to a settler face to face. When shouting broke the stillness, her heart jumped. Riders appeared in the distance, moving quickly across the open land. Dust rose behind them in thick clouds. The camp stirred in confusion. Some of the men reached for their weapons, while elders urged the children to hide. Everything happened too fast. Horses thundered closer. Voices called out in a language Nijoni did not fully understand. She tried to run toward her family, but the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. Someone grabbed her arm. She struggled, but her strength was no match for the firm grip that held her. The world became a blur of movement and noise. She felt herself lifted onto a horse. Her basket fell to the ground, spilling dried herbs into the dust. She twisted to see who had taken her. The man holding the reins was tall and broad-shouldered. His face was lined from years under the harsh sun. He wore a worn hat and a faded shirt. His expression was serious, but not wild or angry like she expected. He did not shout at her. He did not strike her. He simply urged the horse forward. Nijoni's heart pounded. She had heard enough stories to know what this could mean. She kept her chin high, refusing to show fear. If this man thought she would beg, he was wrong. The riders moved quickly away from the camp. As they reached a rocky slope, the other men began to separate, heading in different directions. Soon, only the tall rancher remained with her. The desert stretched endlessly ahead of them, glowing orange under the fading sun. They rode in silence. Nijoni expected harsh words. She expected blame. Instead, the man adjusted the reins carefully, making sure she did not fall. His movements were steady, almost cautious. That confused her more than anything. After a long stretch of riding, they stopped near a small stream. The water reflected the sky's last light. The man dismounted first. He helped her down, but kept a respectful distance once her feet touched the ground. He offered her a canteen. She stared at it, but did not take it. He lifted it slightly, showing her the water inside. His voice was low and calm when he spoke, though she understood only a few words. Still, the tone carried no threat. She refused again. The man nodded once, then set the canteen on a flat stone and stepped back. He turned his attention to his horse, loosening the saddle and letting the animal drink. He did not force her to do anything. That unsettled her. The sky darkened quickly and stars began to appear. The desert at night could be cold and unforgiving. Nijoni knew this well. She remained standing, watching him carefully, ready to run if he made a sudden move. After a while, the man gathered dry branches and built a small fire. The flames flickered softly, casting light across his face. He sat down on one side of the fire and gestured for her to sit on the other. She stayed where she was. He sighed quietly but did not argue. Instead, he pulled out a small piece of bread and some dried meat. He placed half of it near the fire's edge and pushed it toward her with a stick so he would not come too close. Hunger tightened her stomach, but pride held her still. Hours passed. The fire burned lower. The man wrapped himself in a blanket and leaned back against a rock, though he did not close his eyes fully. He remained alert. Nijoni's thoughts raced. Why had he taken her? For revenge? For trade? To send a message to her people? She had seen men filled with anger before. This man did not look like that. His face carried something else, weariness perhaps, or regret. When the wind grew colder, her body began to tremble slightly. The desert night did not care about pride. Slowly, when she was sure he was not watching directly, she reached for the bread and water. She ate carefully, never taking her eyes off him. He noticed but said nothing. Before dawn, he stood and kicked sand over the dying fire. He saddled the horse again. This time, when he helped her mount, his grip was firm but not rough. He avoided looking at her as if unsure whether meeting her gaze would make things worse. The journey continued. As the sun rose, the landscape began to change. Dry desert slowly gave way to a narrow valley with scattered trees. In the distance, she saw a small ranch house made of wood and stone. A barn stood nearby, along with fenced fields and a few grazing cattle. It was not the large, powerful ranch she had imagined. It looked simple, hard-earned. A woman stepped out of the house when they approached. She was older, with gray streaks in her hair and a worried expression. Behind her stood a young girl, no more than 8 years old, clutching a rag doll. The rancher dismounted and spoke quietly to the older woman. His voice carried urgency but not anger. The girl's eyes widened when she saw Nijoni, but she did not scream or hide. Nijoni slid down from the horse on her own this time. She expected ropes. She expected to be locked away. Instead, the rancher spoke again in a steady tone. The older woman nodded slowly. She approached Nijoni carefully and held out a folded blanket. The gesture stunned her. Nijoni did not take it at first. The older woman simply placed it on a nearby fence and stepped back. The rancher then pointed toward the house and spoke a few more words. His voice softened slightly, almost as if he were explaining something important. Though she did not understand every word, she sensed this. She was not here to be harmed. Still, trust did not come easily. She stood in the yard, surrounded by unfamiliar sights and smells. Chickens clucked softly near a coop. A dog lay sleeping in the shade. The young girl watched her with curious eyes, not fear. The rancher removed his hat and ran a hand through his hair. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of emotion cross his face. It was not triumph. It was not cruelty. It was concern. Nijoni wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, not because she trusted them, but because the morning air was still cool. She lifted her chin again, reminding herself who she was. She was Apache. She was strong. She would not break. But as she stood there in the quiet valley, something felt different from the stories she had grown up hearing. The man who had dragged her away from her camp was not behaving like the enemy she expected. And that confused her more than fear ever could. The first full morning at the ranch felt strange to Nijoni. She had barely slept. Every small sound during the night, the wind brushing the walls, the soft steps outside, the low cry of an owl, had kept her alert. She had expected someone to lock the door from the outside. No one did. She had been given a small room near the back of the house. It was simple, with a wooden bed, a thin mattress, and a small window that looked out toward the valley. The blanket from the yard now rested folded at the foot of the bed. No ropes, no guards standing outside. Still, she did not trust it. When the sun rose, golden light filled the valley. She stepped outside carefully. The air smelled of dust, hay, and fresh water from the narrow stream nearby. She scanned the land for signs of danger, her eyes sharp and trained. The rancher, Thomas Callahan, as she later heard the older woman call him, was already awake. He was repairing part of the fence that had broken during the night wind. He worked quietly, hammering nails into place with steady hands. He did not look up when she stepped outside. That surprised her. If he had taken her as a prisoner, why was he not watching her every move? The older woman, whose name was Rosa, came out carrying a basket of laundry. She smiled gently at Nijoni but did not move too close. Rosa spoke slowly, using simple gestures. She pointed toward a water bucket, then toward the stream, then toward herself. It took a moment, but Nijoni understood. Rosa was asking for help. For a second, pride rose inside her. She was not a worker here. She had not chosen to come. But then she remembered something her grandmother once said. Strength is not always shown by refusing. Sometimes it is shown by observing. So she walked toward the bucket without speaking. Rosa's eyes softened with relief. Together they carried the empty buckets to the stream. The water flowed gently, clear and cool. Nijoni knelt and dipped her hands into it. The familiar feeling of running water calmed her racing thoughts. Rosa hummed a soft tune while they worked. It was not a song Nijoni recognized, but it sounded peaceful. When the buckets were full, Rosa struggled slightly with the weight. Without thinking, Nijoni lifted one easily and carried it back toward the house. Rosa gave her a grateful nod. The young girl from the day before watched from a distance. Her name, Nijoni learned later, was Emily. She had bright eyes and a curious mind. Instead of staring with fear, Emily seemed fascinated. As the day passed, Nijoni noticed something unexpected. No one ordered her around. No one demanded she stay in one place. She could move around the yard freely. Thomas worked steadily, fixing tools, feeding cattle, and checking the horses. When one of the horses limped slightly, he stopped everything else to examine its leg. His touch was careful and patient. He spoke softly to the animal as if it could understand him. Nijoni watched closely. In her world, animals were respected. A person who treated animals with care often carried a gentle spirit. By midday, Rosa prepared a simple meal of beans, bread, and dried meat. She placed a plate on the table for Nijoni without saying a word. No one forced her to sit. No one tied her hands. Thomas washed his hands outside before entering. When he stepped inside, he removed his hat and nodded slightly in Nijoni's direction, not as a master would to a servant, but almost as one person acknowledging another. They ate mostly in silence. Emily tried to speak to Nijoni in slow words, pointing to objects and saying their names. Table, chair, water. Her voice was soft and friendly. Though Nijoni did not fully understand, she began to recognize patterns. After the meal, Thomas stepped outside again. Nijoni followed, curious despite herself. She found him near the barn, sharpening a tool. For a moment, she considered asking him why he had taken her. But the words did not come easily. Instead, she stood a few feet away. Thomas sensed her presence and looked up. His expression was serious but not hard. He tapped his chest lightly and said, Thomas. She understood. He was telling her his name. She hesitated, then placed her own hand on her chest. Nijoni. He repeated it slowly, carefully, as if afraid of saying it wrong. The sound of her name in his voice felt strange. For the first time, she saw a hint of relief in his eyes. Later that afternoon, a rider passed along the distant ridge. Nijoni stiffened instantly. Her eyes narrowed. She watched as the rider slowed near the ranch fence but did not enter. Thomas stepped forward calmly, resting one hand on the fence post. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, meeting the rider's gaze from afar. After a few tense moments, the rider continued on. Thomas let out a slow breath. That moment stayed with Nijoni. He had looked cautious, but not angry. It was as if he feared something might happen, not because of her, but because of others. As the sun began to lower again, Emily approached Nijoni with a small wooden doll. She held it out with a shy smile. Nijoni stared at it. The doll was simple but carefully carved. She thought of the beaded necklaces and woven crafts of her own people. Slowly, she knelt and traced the carving with her finger. Emily giggled softly. Rosa watched from the porch, her expression thoughtful. She said something quietly to Thomas when he joined her. Nijoni caught only one word clearly. Safe. Safe. Was that what this place was meant to be? That evening, Thomas brought out an extra blanket and placed it near the doorway of Nijoni's room. He spoke slowly, using gestures again. She caught only pieces of meaning, but one thing became clear. She was free to leave if she wished. He pointed toward the open valley and then back toward the house, letting her understand the choice. The decision surprised her. If she ran now, could she find her people? Would they even be near? Or would she walk straight into the hands of those other riders? She thought about the way Thomas had stood calmly at the fence. She thought about Rosa's soft humming and Emily's curious smile. None of it matched the stories she had heard growing up. That night, as she lay on the narrow bed, she listened carefully again. But this time the sounds of the ranch felt less threatening. The wind brushed gently against the walls. Somewhere outside, Thomas's boots moved across the porch as he checked the lantern. He was keeping watch, not over her, over the land. Nijoni stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what she was feeling. It was not trust, not yet. It was something smaller, something fragile, doubt. Doubt in the idea that every settler was cruel. Doubt in the belief that she had been taken only for harm. The ranch in the valley was not grand or powerful. It was built from hard work, long days, and quiet effort. The people there did not act like enemies waiting to strike. And for the first time since she had been dragged away from her camp, Nijoni felt something she had not expected to feel so soon. Curiosity. Several days passed, and life at the ranch slowly began to follow a pattern. The mornings started early. Thomas would step outside before the sun rose, checking the fences and walking toward the stream. Rosa would light the stove, and Emily would rub sleep from her eyes while peeking out the window. Nijoni watched everything carefully. She still did not fully trust the calm around her. Peace, she knew, could break without warning. She had grown up in a time when fear traveled quickly across the land. Rumors could turn neighbors into enemies overnight. One afternoon, as clouds gathered low in the sky, a distant sound drifted across the valley. It was faint at first, like rolling thunder, but it did not come from the sky. It was the sound of horses. Nijoni stiffened instantly. Her body reacted before her mind did. She moved toward the edge of the yard and climbed onto a low rise near the fence. From there, she could see the ridge clearly. 3 riders were approaching. Thomas noticed the change in her posture. He followed her gaze and saw them too. His jaw tightened, but he did not panic. He handed a tool to Rosa and spoke quietly to her. Rosa quickly guided Emily inside the house. The riders did not slow down as they neared the ranch. Nijoni's heart began to pound. She knew that kind of energy. It was not the pace of travelers passing through. It was the pace of men carrying anger. Thomas walked toward the front gate and stood there calmly. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply waited. The riders stopped a few feet from the fence. Their horses snorted and pawed at the ground. One of the men leaned forward in his saddle and spoke sharply. His voice carried across the yard. Though Nijoni did not understand every word, she recognized the tone, accusation, suspicion. The man pointed toward the house. Then he pointed toward Nijoni. Thomas shook his head firmly. He replied in a steady voice, not raising it, not stepping back. The second rider spoke louder this time. His hand moved sharply as he gestured toward the open land behind the ranch. He said something about missing cattle, about tracks found near the hills, about people hiding. Nijoni's chest tightened. She understood enough now. These men believed her people had taken livestock again. They believed she was part of it. Thomas stepped forward slightly, placing one hand on the fence post. He spoke longer this time. His voice was calm but strong. His words did not sound defensive. They sounded certain. The men did not look satisfied. One of them suggested searching the ranch. Nijoni caught that word clearly. Search. Her breath caught in her throat. If they entered the house and found her belongings, would they force her to leave? Would they drag her away somewhere worse? Thomas shook his head again. His posture changed slightly, not aggressive but firm. He stood taller. The lead rider frowned. The wind carried dust between them. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Thomas did something unexpected. He opened the gate himself, but instead of stepping aside, he walked out and closed the gate behind him, leaving the ranch sealed. He was putting himself between the riders and the house. The men looked surprised. They spoke again, voices sharper now. One of them laughed in disbelief. Thomas did not laugh. He pointed toward the hills, then toward the stream, explaining something carefully. He gestured toward the cattle grazing peacefully inside the fence, showing there were no hidden animals, no signs of stolen property. The men argued back. Nijoni felt her pulse in her ears. She knew that pride could make people act without thinking. One wrong word could turn the air heavy with danger. But Thomas did not raise his voice. He kept speaking steadily. He even removed his hat at one point, as if asking for reason instead of fighting. The riders exchanged looks. They seemed unsure. One of them glanced toward the house again. Inside the window, Nijoni noticed Rosa standing very still, holding Emily close. Fear was clear on her face. Finally, after what felt like endless minutes, the lead rider shook his head. He said something sharp and pulled his horse around. The others followed. The sound of hooves faded slowly into the distance. Thomas remained standing for a few seconds longer, watching until the riders were completely gone. Only then did his shoulders drop slightly. He returned inside the gate and closed it carefully. Rosa stepped out of the house, her face pale. She spoke quickly, asking questions. Thomas responded with a short nod, then glanced toward Nijoni. Their eyes met. In that look, she understood something important. He had refused to let them search the ranch. He had refused to hand her over. That evening, the sky darkened earlier than usual. Heavy clouds rolled in, and the wind began to rise. A storm was coming. As Thomas secured the barn doors, Nijoni approached him slowly. She hesitated, searching for the right words. She pointed toward the hills, then toward the path the riders had taken. She tried to ask in broken words if they would return. Thomas studied her for a moment. Then he shook his head slightly. He lifted one hand, palm down, and lowered it gently, his way of saying, "Calm." He pointed toward the house, then tapped his chest, then pointed outward toward the land. She understood. He was saying he would protect what was his responsibility. Later that night, the storm arrived. Rain fell hard against the roof. Wind pushed against the walls. Thunder rolled across the valley. Emily grew frightened by the noise. Nijoni heard her crying softly from the next room. Without thinking too much, Nijoni stepped into the doorway. She crouched beside the girl and began humming a soft Apache lullaby her grandmother used to sing during storms. The melody was slow and steady, like a heartbeat. Emily's breathing slowly matched the rhythm. Rosa watched from the corner, surprised but grateful. Thomas stood near the fireplace, listening quietly. When the storm finally passed, the air felt clean and fresh. The valley smelled of wet earth and leaves, but something inside Nijoni had shifted too. She replayed the moment at the gate again and again in her mind. Thomas could have avoided trouble by letting the riders search. He could have made things easier for himself. Instead, he had stood between her and their anger, not because he owed her, not because she was family, but because he believed it was right. The next morning, as the sun rose bright and clear, Nijoni walked toward the fence line on her own. She studied the ground carefully. Her eyes traced faint marks in the soil that others might miss. After a few minutes, she found what she was looking for, hoofprints leading away from the ranch, toward a rocky trail that curved around the valley. They were not the ranch's cattle. They were fresh tracks. She stood there quietly, thinking. Then she turned and walked toward Thomas, who was stacking firewood. She gestured for him to follow. At first, he looked confused, but he trusted her enough to walk beside her toward the fence. When she showed him the tracks, his expression changed. He knelt down, studying them closely. He looked at her, surprised. She pointed toward the distant ridge. Someone else had taken the cattle, not her people, not from this ranch. Thomas slowly nodded, understanding. For the first time, they were not standing on opposite sides of fear. They were standing side by side, facing the truth together. And in that quiet moment beneath the open sky, something stronger than suspicion began to grow. Respect, the discovery of the hoofprints, changed something between them. It was no longer just a matter of protection or silence. Now there was shared understanding. Thomas knew that someone else was responsible for the missing cattle. Nijoni knew that he had believed her without needing many words. But peace did not last long. 2 days later, another rider came to the ranch. This time he came alone. His horse looked tired and his face carried urgency. Nijoni watched from near the barn as he spoke quickly to Thomas. Even without understanding every word, she sensed trouble. Thomas's expression grew serious. He asked short questions. The rider pointed toward the town beyond the hills. He used the word meeting several times. After the rider left, Thomas stood still for a long moment, staring at the ground. Rosa stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. She asked what had happened. Thomas explained quietly. There would be a gathering in town that evening. Some ranchers believed local Apache groups were planning another raid. They wanted to form patrols and deal with it themselves. Nijoni understood enough to feel the weight of it. If fear grew stronger, reason would grow weaker. Thomas looked toward her. There was concern in his eyes, not blame. He walked closer and spoke slowly. He explained that he needed to go to town. He would try to calm things down. Then he did something that surprised her again. He handed her a small pouch of dried food and pointed toward the back hills. He made a walking motion with his fingers. Then he pointed toward her and then to the open land. He was giving her a choice. If she wanted to leave, now would be the time. The hills behind the ranch led toward familiar desert paths. If she traveled carefully, she might find signs of her people. Her heart felt torn. Freedom was right there. The open land called to her. She imagined walking under the wide sky again, hearing her language spoken around a fire. But she also thought about the men at the gate. About the riders who carried anger like a torch. If they returned while Thomas was gone, would Rosa and Emily be safe? Thomas waited quietly, not pressuring her. She looked toward the hills once more, then she shook her head. She would stay. A flicker of relief crossed his face. He nodded once in thanks, then saddled his horse and rode toward town. The ranch felt different without him. The air seemed heavier. Rosa tried to keep busy, but worry showed in her movements. Emily stayed close to Nijoni, as if sensing the tension. As the afternoon passed, Nijoni could not sit still. She climbed the small rise near the fence again and watched the distant road. The sun moved lower. Shadows stretched long across the valley. Then far away she saw dust rising, more than one rider. Her stomach tightened. She ran down the slope and called out softly to Rosa. The older woman hurried outside. They both saw the approaching figures, 3 riders again, but Thomas was not with them. Panic flickered in Rosa's eyes. She pulled Emily close and looked toward Nijoni, unsure what to do. Nijoni felt her mind sharpen. Fear could not guide them now. She remembered the tracks she had found. She remembered the storm. She remembered how Thomas had stood firm at the gate. Now it was her turn to stand firm. She motioned for Rosa and Emily to go inside and stay low. She moved quickly toward the barn and untied one of the horses. not to escape, but to create movement in the yard. When the riders reached the fence, she was already there, holding the horses' reins calmly. They looked surprised to see her alone. One of them called out sharply, asking where Thomas was. She did not answer directly. Instead, she lifted her chin and pointed toward the town. Then she pointed toward the hills behind them and shook her head firmly. Her message was simple. There was no threat here. The men did not seem satisfied. One of them suggested again that they search the ranch. This time there was no Thomas to block the gate. The wind blew softly through the dry grass. The valley felt very quiet. Nijoni stepped closer to the fence. She placed one hand on the top rail and met their eyes without fear. Then she did something unexpected. She pointed toward the distant rocky trail where she had found the hoofprints days earlier. She traced the direction in the air with her finger. The men looked confused. She knelt quickly and drew a rough shape in the dirt with a stick. A small ranch, a path, a curve in the hills. She pointed to the drawing and then to the hills again. Understanding slowly dawned on their faces. She was telling them the cattle had gone another way. One of the riders leaned down from his horse, studying the simple map. He exchanged glances with the others. They spoke quietly among themselves. Moments stretched long. Finally, the lead rider gave a short nod. He turned his horse slightly, glancing one last time at the house. Then they rode away, heading toward the rocky trail. Nijoni remained standing until they disappeared. Her legs felt weak once the dust settled. She let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Rosa stepped outside carefully, Emily peeking from behind her skirt. Relief washed over their faces when they saw the riders were gone. That evening the sky turned deep orange. The valley glowed softly. When Thomas finally returned, he looked tired. The meeting in town had been tense. Many ranchers were angry and afraid. He had argued for patience, but not everyone had agreed. As he rode into the yard, he saw the expressions on Rosa and Emily's faces. He sensed something had happened. Rosa quickly explained. She pointed toward Nijoni, describing how she had stood at the gate and shown the riders another path. Thomas listened closely. Then he turned to Nijoni. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic words. He simply placed his hand over his heart and nodded deeply. It was a gesture of respect. That night, as they sat around the small fire outside, the air felt different again. Not tense, not uncertain, stronger. Nijoni realized something important. She had once believed she was dragged to this ranch only as a prisoner. She had believed Thomas was her enemy without knowing him, but today she had protected his home, and he had trusted her enough to leave. The world beyond the valley was still uncertain. Fear still moved through nearby towns. Decisions made by others could change everything again. But here, in this small ranch surrounded by open land, something rare had grown. Not perfect trust, not complete safety, but a shared choice. A choice to stand for fairness instead of fear. And that choice, made quietly without loud words, would shape what happened next. The days after the riders left felt calmer, but the calm carried a new meaning. It was no longer the uneasy silence of strangers living under the same roof. It was the quiet that comes after something important has changed. Nijoni felt it the moment she stepped outside the next morning. The valley looked the same. The stream flowed gently. The cattle grazed peacefully. The wooden house stood strong against the early light. But inside her heart, something was different. She no longer felt like someone trapped between two worlds. She felt like someone standing in the middle of a bridge. Thomas was already awake, fixing a loose hinge on the barn door. When he noticed her, he paused for a second. There was no awkwardness now, only understanding. He handed her a small hammer without speaking. She took it. Together they finished repairing the hinge. They did not need many words. Their movements were steady, natural. The silence between them was no longer filled with doubt. Later that afternoon, a familiar sound echoed faintly from the hills. It was not rushed like before. It was steady and controlled. Nijoni froze. She knew that rhythm. Apache riders. Her heart began to race, but this time it was not from fear. It was from recognition. She climbed the rise near the fence again. In the distance, she saw 3 figures approaching slowly. They rode with awareness, scanning the land carefully. Thomas stepped beside her. He followed her gaze and saw them too. He did not move toward the house. He did not prepare for conflict. He simply stood there. The riders came closer and stopped a short distance from the ranch. Their faces were serious but not aggressive. One of them, an older man with calm eyes, looked directly at Nijoni. She stepped forward slowly. Her feet felt heavy yet steady. She spoke in her own language for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Her voice was clear but emotional. She explained where she had been. She explained what had happened. She told them about the riders who blamed their people for missing cattle. She told them about the tracks leading elsewhere. The older man listened carefully. The other two riders remained silent. When she finished, there was a long pause. Then the older man nodded slowly. He spoke in a calm tone. He said they had been searching for her. They feared she had been harmed. They feared she had been taken somewhere cruel. She turned and looked at Thomas. He stood quietly, hat in hand, showing respect without understanding every word. Nijoni translated slowly, using simple phrases Thomas could understand. She explained that her people had come for her. Thomas nodded once. He stepped forward a little and spoke gently. He said she was free to leave. He said she had always been free. The words were simple, but they carried weight. Nijoni felt tears press against her eyes, but she kept her posture strong. This was the moment she had imagined many times since arriving at the ranch. Freedom stood before her. Her people were here. The open desert called her home, but the valley behind her held something real too. It held Rosa's soft songs in the morning. It held Emily's curious questions and shy smiles. It held the memory of Thomas standing at the gate, refusing to give her up. She turned back to the older Apache rider and spoke again. This time her voice was steady, not rushed. She explained that the ranch was not a place of harm. She explained that fear was growing on both sides because of false blame. The older man listened, thinking deeply. After a while, he spoke quietly to the other riders. They exchanged thoughtful looks. Then something unexpected happened. The older man guided his horse a few steps forward and raised his hand in greeting toward Thomas. Thomas understood the gesture. He stepped closer to the fence and placed his hand over his heart. No grand speech, no long negotiation, just two men acknowledging each other across years of misunderstanding. The moment felt fragile, like glass that could break if handled carelessly. Nijoni realized that her choice now mattered more than ever. She could leave with her people and return to the life she knew, or she could help create something new here. After a long breath, she made her decision. She would return to her people, for now. But she would not leave in anger. She would leave with connection. She walked toward Thomas and spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. She thanked him. She told him that not all settlers were the same. She told him he had shown her respect when she expected none. Thomas listened, his eyes steady. He nodded and handed her a small cloth bundle. Inside were dried food and the beaded necklace she had dropped the night she was taken. He had kept it safe. That small act meant more than any long speech. Rosa came forward next. She embraced Nijoni gently, her eyes shining with emotion. Emily ran up and hugged her tightly, not wanting her to go. Nijoni knelt and placed the wooden doll back into Emily's hands. She smiled softly. Then she turned and walked toward her people. As she mounted a horse offered by one of the riders, she looked back one last time. Thomas stood by the fence. He did not look proud. He did not look victorious. He looked hopeful. The riders moved away slowly, not in a hurry. The ranch grew smaller in the distance. Days later, Nijoni returned fully to her community. She told them the truth of what she had seen. She told them that anger alone would not solve anything. She told them that sometimes courage meant standing still instead of fighting. At first, some doubted her. But over time, her words carried weight. She had lived the experience. Months passed. Small changes began to happen in the valley. Trade between the ranch and nearby Apache groups started quietly. Food was exchanged fairly. Messages were carried honestly. The ranch became known as neutral ground, not perfect, not free from tension, but different. Years later, when children asked about the time she had been taken to a ranch, Nijoni did not tell the story with bitterness. She told it as a lesson. She told them how fear can paint a face before you truly see it. She told them how one choice can change the path of many. And at the ranch in the valley, Thomas sometimes sat on his porch in the evening watching the sunset. Emily grew older. Rosa's hair turned fully gray. Travelers who passed through would sometimes hear the quiet story of the Apache woman who had once arrived as a captive and left as a bridge between two worlds. History did not change overnight. The land still carried old wounds. But in that small valley, something rare had taken root. Respect. And sometimes respect is where real change begins.